All right, peace to everybody tuning in. All glory, all honor, all praise is due to the Most High God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, in the name of his only begotten Son, as usual. And this is another follow-up video to the initial Pentecost and the Sabbath count video. And in this video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at this monthly Sabbath doctrine and trying to use it to map out the Pentecost count. And we're going to see how this actually falls apart. All right. Now, just very quick on this monthly Sabbath doctrine. The doctrine is that every day 7 of the biblical month is your Sabbath day. So you get one Sabbath a month. That'll be the 7th day of every month. And on top of that, you will also include your holy convocations throughout the year. So example, you got Feast of Unleavened Bread the first day, and then we got the last day of the feast. And as well, other holy convocations that would be included, Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles, those two holy convocations. And it's funny because this one is left out, the Feast of Weeks. Leviticus 23 and 21 says, "And ye shall proclaim on the self same day that it may be a holy convocation unto you." So this is a holy convocation as well. But what's being taught is we don't keep Feast of Weeks because we no longer do harvest. But that's funny because Feast of Tabernacles, which is also called Feast of Ingathering, Ingathering means the gathering of the harvest. We don't do this anymore, but yet we still keep Feast of Tabernacles. Also, what we got to remember for the Feast of Weeks, it says, "It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations." So this is mandatory. We can't pick and choose which feast we're going to keep based on what land we're currently dwelling in. Now, another thing with this doctrine is they teach that Pentecost and Feast of Weeks are two separate things. They're two separate days, but they are linked to each other. So the teaching is Pentecost is the 7th Sabbath of the year because they only do monthly. And then Feast of Weeks would fall 50 days after that 7th Sabbath. Basically saying that the 7 Sabbaths mentioned in Leviticus 23 are separate from the 7 weeks mentioned in Deuteronomy 16. Also, one thing to note is that the scriptures do not indicate anywhere in Leviticus 23, Deuteronomy 16, or anywhere else in the scriptures that the 7th Sabbath of the year is to be observed as Pentecost. Pentecost, you don't even see that word until the New Testament. That's a Greek word. So where's the instruction for Pentecost? I see an instruction for Feast of Weeks, but I don't see one for Pentecost if we're saying they are not the same. Our God is crystal clear on his instructions. All right, so we're going to take a look at that and let's really examine that and see if that makes any type of sense. So according to 2026, if you go according to the dark moon, the new moon would have been March 19th. So the first Sabbath, the 7th day of that month would have been March 25th. So that's Sabbath 1. Then we go to our Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's Sabbath 2. Then the last day of the feast, Sabbath 3. And then we got Ziph, the 2nd month. We got Sabbath 4, which would have landed on April 23rd. And then we got Sivan, the 3rd month, Sabbath 5, which would have landed May 22, according to this count. And then we got the 4th month, Sabbath falling June 21st. And then the 7th Sabbath of the year would be considered Day of Pentecost, and that would be July 20th of 2026. All right, so 50 days from July 20th, we land at September 8th, 2026. This would be 3 days before blowing of trumpets that's scheduled for September 11th, 2026. And then we have Feast of Tabernacles coming September 25th, 2026. So the time from September 8th to September 25th, let's see how much that is. So this would be 17 days apart. All right. Now here's the problem. Here's the problem with this count. Deuteronomy 16 and 16 says, 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God, in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread, and in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Empty. This is what I want to focus on. They can't appear empty. All right, so back to this timeline. So the men would have came here, Passover, brought what they had to Jerusalem. Then they wouldn't appear for all the way up until right before the 7th month. That's approximately 6 months, give or take. And they would bring their harvest. And then another 17 days later have to bring another harvest. And if it's not harvest they're bringing, what are they bringing? This is called the Feast of Ingathering. So let's really think about this critically. They would have came on the Feast of Weeks to present before the Lord their God, not empty-handed. Then they would have 17 days to come up with another offering, another harvest. So they got to go back home and hope for another harvest within 17 days to come back and present for tabernacles. Either that or what's being implied is when the men would come for the Feast of Weeks, they wouldn't present everything. They would hold some back. They would hold some back for the Lord's feast. Imagine holding back for the Lord's feast. So they would hold some back and then present the leftovers of what they held back 17 days later. This doesn't really make any sense. The only way it can make sense if we're saying they held back for the Feast of Weeks in order to have something for tabernacles, but who holds back for the Most High's feast? On top of this, the Feast of Weeks is called the Feast of the First Fruits of Wheat Harvest. Right here, the first fruits of wheat harvest. Wheat harvest starts in May, June, according to the Gregorian or Julian calendar, whatever you want to call it. So if the wheat harvest happens here, and this is around Sivan, the 3rd month, how do you have the presentation of the wheat harvest all the way days before the blowing of trumpets? This is not where the first fruits of the wheat harvest would be presented. And then it says, and the feast of ingathering at the year's end. So this is 2 different events. If you're going with the once a month Sabbath model, this now becomes one combined event, 2 weeks apart approximately. This does not work agriculturally, even logistically. The men would have to show up, Feast of Weeks. They're either staying for 2 weeks until Tabernacles, then staying another week. So that's 3 weeks they got to stay in Jerusalem. Or the men would have to go back home and hope they can come back with something within 2 weeks by the Feast of Tabernacles. This doesn't even work logistically. Take in travel time, take in lodging, take in all of that. This doesn't even work. So this video is not to bash or to disrespect anybody who's keeping the once a month Sabbath, but this is just rather to shed light and for us to really examine this. All right. Now, I hope that can bring a little bit more clarity to what I was saying in the Pentecost and Sabbath count video. I hope this visualization of a timeline helps to make it a bit more clear. And with that being said, peace and blessings, and may the Most High be with you.